Hey guys, I'm Julia. I am the president of the UNCG Atheists, Agnostics, and Skeptics, if you do not know. So after the talk tonight, we are all going to be going to Natty Green's to drink and eat in the bar upstairs if you would like to join. And also just a little reminder, tomorrow at 5:30, we're doing the Out of the Garden project, volunteering. They're a local food drive. We get together, put food in bags. It's at the C3 Church Warehouse in Jamestown-ish area?
It's in Greensboro.
Greensboro? Okay. So we're going to meet at the Weatherspoon Art Museum parking lot for carpooling and caravanning. If you don't want to do that, you can meet us at 6 there. It's always a lot of fun. So just a little plug for that. So tonight, you're all here to hear Jesse Galef talk about the Defense Against the Dark Arts, the psychology and ethics of persuasion. So Jesse has built a career in the secular movement, serving as the communications director of the Secular Student Alliance for the past 4 years, and working for the Secular Coalition for America and the American Humanist Association before that. In addition to crafting various fundraising letters and public statements, he has acted as a national spokesman in outlets across the country, including the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Fox News, and CNN. He went to school here in Carolina, graduating from UNC Chapel Hill. So, Jesse.
All right. How's everybody doing tonight? Okay, cool. Welcome. This is maybe the fifth time I've given this talk. I started giving it at the University of Chicago about a year ago. A lot of things have changed since then. I've incorporated new things, taken some things out. The one thing that I've tried to keep since the beginning, since I loved it so much, were the flyers they made. I saw some of them posted here. I really love it, and this was my favorite, the Mad Eye movie. There was a series of all of the Defense Against the Dark Arts professors. By the way, how many of you have actually read or seen the Harry Potter books and movies? Almost everybody, okay. I didn't read it until college. I was sort of stubborn and resisted until my sister bought me the box set of 5 at the time. That was all that was out. I got strep and mono at the same time. Perfect time to stay in bed and read hundreds and hundreds of pages. But Mad Eye Moody is my favorite, for those of you that recognize it, mostly because I can move one eye independently of the other, and I feel a strange affinity for his strange extra eye. But I've been doing this for 5 years, almost 6 coming up, doing communications and PR work for secular causes. As Julia said, the Secular Coalition for America before the Secular Student Alliance, that was a lobbying organization on K Street. When you hear about the evil K Street lobbyists, we had a small shop set up trying to lobby for the interests of the secular Americans. Give media trainings at the Secular Student Alliance conference last year and the year before that. And so this has been an interest of mine that's been going on for a while. But let's start with sort of what we're going over, what we are going to start with. And what do we mean by persuasion? There are 2 broad types. One is persuading people to do something you want them to do, take action. And another is getting people to believe something you want them to believe. And I'm going to pull a lot of psychology studies that talk about both of these, throw them at you. There's far too many of them. I can't talk about all of the really neat studies, but I have a reading list at the end in case you want to look up more. We're going to talk about how persuasion works, which is not at all how I thought it worked when I started getting involved with this cause. How we can defend ourselves, because it's very easy to fall prey to powerful persuasion techniques. And last, how do we use this ethically? And this is a particular concern, and I want to use a Harry Potter theme throughout the talk, but if you were in a world in which wizards could cast a spell and make somebody entirely believe them 100%, how would you feel about that world? It sounds kind of creepy, doesn't it? The idea that people can just make you do and make you think what they want. Well, let's say it's not entirely 100% accurate, maybe only 50% of the time it works, and it makes you more persuadable. It's still pretty creepy. I would be uncomfortable being around wizards if I knew they could cast that spell. And then what if it weren't a spell and it was a psychological trick? And suddenly you have the world we're living in which there are some techniques that are surprisingly powerful. We don't realize they're happening most of the time, but really can be exploitative. And we need to figure out how to use this power well. So hopefully I'm not teaching you dark arts, I'm teaching you defense against the dark arts, and how to use these tricks well to make the world a better place. Let's start with a show of hands. I'm curious, to influence somebody, how many of you would say something you believe to be untrue? So lie. Nobody? Okay. How many of you would tell a misleading or non-representative story, but it were true? Okay. Some hands. How many of you would distribute a chemical that helps your arguments? Okay. A couple. And how many of you would recite a magic phrase that inspires people to trust you? Okay, so if there were these powers, some of you would be comfortable using them. Out of curiosity, how many of you would actually do these things but didn't want to admit it in public? 10 points from Slytherin. You're terrible at this. I used to think, fairly naively, that this wasn't how the world worked. I used to think that if people hear all sides of an issue, then the truth will win out. This is the marketplace of ideas hypothesis and framework for advocating for free speech. That if everybody gets to say what they want and everybody hears it, that the truth will win and we'll have the right beliefs. It's promoted by John Stuart Mill, who was a big influence on me in college. Thomas Jefferson, a big fan. It's been a phrase in the Supreme Court cases. How many of you can spot an unrealistic or implausible expectation in this?
Well, I think the problem with this statement is it assumes that all of the sides will be presented in a persuasive manner that will make people actually want to hear them.
Yeah. There are a lot of problems with this. That's one of them. So I broke it down. If you thought the first line was implausible, you're right. This is just, people don't hear all sides of the story. It's not really fair. The sides aren't equally strong. And if you said the second half, you're also right. This is completely implausible, that the truth will always win out with more speech being said. And to me, who I was brought up with this fresh-faced idealistic image of how persuasion worked, this has been really sad for me to discover and learn more of, which I just sound like a sad dummy. So let's break these one at a time. If people hear all sides of a story, this is unrealistic because it's not easy to get people to listen. One of the repeated findings in psychology is called confirmation bias. People have a tendency to pay more attention to the evidence that supports what they want to believe or already believe, and they tend to dismiss or ignore or even avoid arguments that conflict with what they want to believe. There was a really neat study in which students were taken and split into groups. They were asked to listen to a message. It was a very anti-religious message. Somebody just giving a speech. But there was a lot of static. And the researchers apologized and said, yeah, it's a little tough to hear, I'm sorry, but here, we push this button and the static will clear up for a little bit. And maybe for a few seconds it would clear up, and then it would go back to pretty bad static and you couldn't hear it very well. There were two groups of students that were allowed to do this: strongly religious students and non-religious students. For a strong message like this against religion, the non-religious students pressed the button far more because they were more interested in hearing this. They wanted to pay attention, they wanted to listen. The religious students, not so much. They were willing to let it just be fuzzed over by the noise and static. This is not to say that atheists are better at paying attention and they want to engage. It goes both sides. I'm pretty sure that if it were a strongly religious message, the atheist would be more likely to ignore the message. Secondly, the whole truth. This is impossible. In court, this is the closest we come to forcing all sides to be part of the conversation. We have the jury. We sit them down and tell them they can't leave. The judge sits there and says, all right, lawyers, bring whatever you want, and we're going to throw out the lies and misleading things, but the jury will listen to everything you say. But that's not happening almost anywhere else. And we start with, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, or nothing but the truth? And what does that mean? How much of the truth? Starting with the Big Bang and going from there? Well, there I was in my mother's fallopian tubes, and starting from that, I then grew up to a small ship. No. Which truths are relevant is a really important part of persuasion and communication in general, even if you're not deliberately trying to persuade people. So even if you're not telling the whole truth, trying to tell truths, which truths do you share? And I'm not saying lie. I really am not. I'm saying tell the truth, but selecting which ones to share at any given time is an important part of communication. And so you want to do that without being two-faced. And that was entirely a gag to show the cruel Voldemort from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And if you don't like Harry Potter references, I would say I'm sorry, I'm not. I enjoy this. So if you are trying to inspire action, trying to get people to do something, do you a favor, give to charity, which truths do you want to share? What do you want to tell people? This is the content of what you're saying. And so there was a study in which students were asked to fill out a survey, and at the end, as a reward, they were given $5. And that's when the real study began. Most psychology studies lie to their subjects to get at the real interesting stuff. And with this $5, they were also given a chance to donate money to alleviate starvation in Africa. Some of them were just given statistics about how bad things were in Africa, and on average, they gave $1.14. That's not bad. I'd be impressed if all Americans gave more than 20% of their income to charity. But that's a pretty good summation. Summary, it's what's going on, it's how many people are affected. But what if you just told one story? An anecdote of one little girl called Rokia. Does anybody want to guess how much money was donated when the story was shared?
$3.
$3? Anybody else?
All $5.
All five? So what happened? It more than doubled, up to $2.38. This is one story. It's not really that much information about what's happening in Africa. And yet that's what inspired people to give money and donate and take action. And that's because it inspired our emotion. It really gets our attention. As human beings, we are not perfect computers, nor should we be. And so what really filters into our brains, what we pay attention to, what connects with us, is stories about people and anecdotes. And hearing this, I was fairly disheartened. I really want people to be more impacted by statistics and a full sense of what's going on. And then I heard this, and I was sad. And I thought, well, but what if you give people both? Tell them the story and give them the statistics so they know that this story is happening all over the place. Anybody want to guess how much was donated with the statistics and the anecdote? Less? Any numbers? More or less than the $1.14?
Less than $1.
Less than $1.14? Anybody else?
$1.50.
$1.50. So you're more cynical than I am, which is fantastic. $1.43. That was close. So giving people the statistics brought their donations back down. And it's about getting, besides the fact that it might be daunting, seeing how much starvation and work there is to be done in Africa, it's also the case that when people are in an analytic mindset versus a emotive mindset, they are not as charitable. They're not inspired to give. There were studies in which people were primed before a similar chance to give, and they were either asked to write down words they associated with baby, or they were asked to do simple math problems. And of course, when they were primed with thoughts of babies and emotions, they gave more. So it's not just that people are overwhelmed by the task, which is probably true, but also emotion is important. And it does that because you inspire emotion. If you get very few things from this talk, one is that emotion has to factor into decision making. And even if I wish people could behave perfectly rationally, we are humans, and it's important to acknowledge that as we make our decisions. But let's say we're not trying to get people to take action. We want to inform them, we want to educate them. Surely the statistics are better so that people have a more comprehensive understanding. So one study that was done around the Milgram experiments and after the big World War, trying to get a sense of why people were willing to go along with authority and didn't help each other as much. The scientists got subjects in a room, and they were made to think that their partner, who they just met, was having a seizure in the other room. When you met your partner in the first room, they said, I'm a little nervous and I have epilepsy. It might get triggered when I get stressed. I hope everything's okay. And then you're on different sides of the wall. You hear him start to seize up. How many of you think that you would get up to help right away? Okay, a lot of you. And this is really commonly viewed, that we have a view of human nature that people are pretty good. We like to help each other. We like to get up and no, sorry. There are a lot of impacts that prevent people from getting up and really taking action. One of them is the bystander effect. I think somebody else will do it. We don't want to be the one personally to deal with it. And so in the moment, people didn't get up to help. It turns out that of the 15 that were studied, it's a small study, but it's not the point of this in the moment, only 4 of them got up to help. That's much lower than people predicted. So what researchers did, I think 8 years later, Nisbet and Borgia, asked their classes. So they'd been teaching this statistic to try to teach people that, no, we're not quite as altruistic and motivated as we think. And the class was surprised at the statistic. But it doesn't help you make predictions. It doesn't help you actually understand human nature. So they got 2 groups. They explained the experiment, what had happened 8 years ago. And one group, without being told the results, was asked how many people of the 15 would get up and help, and how quickly. And people were far too optimistic. That's understandable. Another group was told about the experiment and told that only 4 out of the 15 had gotten up to help right away. And then they were shown 2 interviews with supposed people in the original experiment of the 15 and asked to predict whether those 2 people had gotten up to help. The answers were identical. It turns out that no, knowing the base rate, knowing that 27% had gotten up, they knew that fact, they knew the statistic, but when they were shown people that they could identify with and see the face of, they thought, oh, it's a statistic, but these people would get up to help. Knowing that it's only 27% didn't actually factor in. To me, that's pretty sad. What are psychology classes doing? Daniel Kahneman, a cutting-edge researcher in behavioral economics, a pioneer in the field, I talk about him a lot more later, said this really calls into question a lot of the psychology classes and the methods we use. Because if we don't help people make predictions about the world with our classes, then what are we doing? We're helping people recite facts. But it turns out, interestingly, they did a third follow-up. A third group was told about the experiment. They were not told this 27% base rate. They were shown the interviews, and then told that those 2 people had not gotten up to help. So they were given anecdotes, 2 people with concrete results. And then they were asked to guess the base rate of how likely another person would be to get up. And they were surprisingly accurate. If we give people representative anecdotes, that does better at helping them understand the world than giving them the full statistics. And I really wish that weren't true. I want to have a more optimistic view of human nature and intelligence and rationality, but this is quite disheartening. And the researchers who did the study, I want to get this quote, said that people's inability or stubbornness and unwillingness to infer the general from the specific from the general was matched only by their willingness to infer the general from the particulars. We're dealing with humans. If we were trying to program a computer to do this, it would be very different. But knowing that you're trying to communicate with a human being and persuade a human being, knowing this kind of information is really important, because otherwise you're not going to be very effective. When you're choosing truths, do you want to show both sides? It might be very tempting to show only your side and ignore the other. Huge meta-analysis has been done of all of these studies over 50 years. It turns out that, yes, you do want to show both sides. So this is a little bit good in my eyes, that you don't want to conceal facts. You do want to show why there's another argument, but only if you refute the other side right away. It makes sense, in a sense, that if you hear an argument for a claim, and then you hear why it's bad, you say, oh, I guess the argument was bad, and the claim must be false. But what you end up getting is the inoculation effect. James McGuire coined this and studied it. He was actually trying to find ways to defend prisoners of war from brainwashing. I think it was in Korea. He would introduce arguments against America and then refute them over and over again in different ways to help Americans resist brainwashing when they got captured. It's pretty cool, and it's an inoculation, much like the immune system. You have a weak argument, kill it, and in the future you are more resistant to persuasion. Sounds pretty good, but it comes up with one of the most depressing results that I've seen called the backfire effect. When you try to persuade people with a very strong opinion, especially when it's part of their core identity, if you don't convince them, they end up more strongly held. So it's explained well in a quote. when your deepest convictions are challenged by contradictory evidence, your beliefs get stronger. That's not how the brain should work. This is from David McRaney, You Are Not So Smart. It's a fantastic blog about cognitive science and reasoning. He just had a book come out by the same title. So what this means when we're trying to persuade people, especially about their deeply held identity beliefs, if at first you don't succeed, you've made it tougher in the future. It's not that you slowly wear people down, you reinforce their identity. There were studies done, people who identified very strongly as conservatives, and this goes both ways again. I'm not picking out one side only. People who identified very strongly as conservatives, they were asked how likely it was that weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq. And there were two groups. One was shown an article in which, a fake article, that quoted George Bush talking about why he believed there were weapons of mass destruction. Another group was shown the exact same article with one paragraph added about how weapon inspectors had found no weapons or no evidence of it. The people who heard the correction were more confident that weapons were actually in Iraq. That's not how brains should work, which gets us to this other part of where I was wrong and idealistic, that the truth will win out with more evidence, that evidence should move you closer to the truth over time. I mentioned Daniel Kahneman. He did a lot of work in this, and he separated the brain functions into two rough heuristics. He acknowledges that it's really general, but it's useful framework to say system one, all of the parts of the brain that are really intuitive, they're fast, they are instinctive, and they use a lot of heuristics, and they take less mental energy. System two is more deliberate, it's conscious thought, it's effortful, and we evolved not to really engage it unless we had to. Most of the time we operate on sort of heuristics, and we replace really hard questions with easier ones that we can use heuristics on. The problem, I mean, that's pretty good. I like efficiency. We have limited mental cycles, and we don't want to use them when we don't have to. But the problem is that these heuristics can be hacked. The more we learn about them, the more we find that advertising and persuasion artists and politicians can use these heuristics to get what they want. And that's some of what I want to get into. One example to show that these unconscious factors matter. Researchers went into an office where there was an honor system. People who drank coffee, there was milk, and when they drank milk, there was a collection to replace the milk. And nobody was paying attention to who drank how much milk and how much they'd given. But the researchers tried putting up an image on the wall, either of flowers or of eyes watching. Week to week, they alternated back and forth, and at the end, counted how much money per liter of milk drank. They didn't know how much each person had done, but on net. So here are the pictures. How visible are they? Yeah, it's not too bad. The bottom one scares me a lot. And these were just on the wall. And each week, this is the chart of how much people donated per how much milk they drank. Almost triple donations for having a set of eyes on the wall. We have a heuristic going on in the back of our head, an unconscious process that if we are being watched, we should demonstrate more pro-social behavior. But how many of those people do you think really believed they were giving more because there was a set of eyes on the wall? No. What happens is that a lot of these factors are affecting our judgment, and then we come up with reasons to explain them. If we try to understand why our decisions are being made, most of us don't really know. It's tough. There's a lot going on in here we don't understand it yet, but we come up with reasons, and then we feel pretty good about it. Our system one feels an answer, and system two explains it away. And the best way to categorize this and explain it comes from Stephen Koss, that you are not the king of your brain, you are the creepy guy standing next to the king going, a most judicious choice. So, if this is how we make decisions, and we're learning this, and we need to deal with the fact that humans are the way we are, let's start going into some of these heuristics. Remember, these are persuasion techniques and mind hacks, and we'll talk about the ethics very soon, but be aware of them as we're going through. The halo effect, well documented about how attractive or how the person looks who's presenting the information. And if the person is attractive, we associate that with them being good. They're more trustworthy, they're more competent. Attractive politicians got, I think, 2.5 times as many votes as unattractive politicians. 73% of people denied that looks had anything to do with their vote. Yeah, right? Also, attractive defendants were less likely to receive jail time and received lower sentences. That's not how our justice system is supposed to work, but we're humans and humans in the jury box. Height is associated with power and skill. Robert Cialdini, who did a lot of the first work on, he called it compliance studies and compliance techniques, hypothesizes that this is why con men use lifts in their shoes, trying to seem taller and bigger. That there was a classroom, and somebody came in to do a guest lecture, and he was lecturing, and at the end, the class had to rate how tall he was, describe how good he was at lecturing, etc. But different groups were told different titles. They were told either that he was a TA or a grad student, I forget, an associate professor, a visiting lecturer, or a full Oxford professor, some progression. And surprisingly, people rated him half an inch taller, each bump up in status. And we just have this strong association that tall people are powerful. Politicians tend to be much taller than the average citizen. Taller politicians tend to win. Shouldn't happen, it does. Welcome to being jaded like me. Similarity implies that people deserve your favor, either that they're more truthful or that you should do things that they ask. It kind of makes sense, they're part of your tribe, but it can be pretty easily hacked. And if you dress like people, if you look like people, or even surprisingly, if you have a similar name, they will do you more favors. Howard Gardner, I think his name is, did a survey, sent out surveys, didn't care about the results. Remember, psychologists lie. He just wanted to see how many people would send it back because he'd asked. In one group, it come under a letter from one of his researchers. 5, I think about 30% replied and sent the survey back. But if instead of the researcher's name, he pretended that it was coming from somebody with a very similar name that sounded the same, had some of the same letters as the person receiving it. So, George Smith might get a letter from a researcher, John, perhaps, John Smith. Compliance and returns went up to 56% because it was a similar name. There's no good reason for this, but we have the idea that, oh, they're like me. Yeah, I'll do them a favor. Delivery. Delivery happens a lot, has a lot of effect on how we process the information. Repetition is interpreted as truth. The more we hear something, the more easy it is to bring to mind, the more likely we think that, yeah, it's probably true. People were presented with a series of statements and told that they were either true or false at the time. Later, they were given another set of statements, some of which were from the original set, and asked to rate how likely they thought it was to be true, each statement. The statements that they had seen before were more likely to be rated as true, even if they'd been told it was false at the time. That's wrong. Rhyming feels like truth. People were given statements like, patience and measure will win you treasure, and asked to rate how true that was and how well it described the world. That was rated as more true and accurate than patience and measure will win you riches. It rhymes. Try to use it. Poetry. Cursing shows passion. I like this one, that there was a speech given about, I think it was raising tuition prices. And one version of the speech had no cursing at all. Another version introduced a small, just damn it, at the beginning to show passion, or at the end. They were rated as more persuasive. They also asked whether it lowered the speaker's credibility. No, there was no real drop-off in credibility, possibly because it's a pretty mild swear word, I guess. But and lastly, repetition is interpreted as truth. But there's another study I wanted to bring up that in a group, people were asked to rate the consensus opinion. And one person repeating themselves 3 times had 90% as much impact as 3 different people saying it when people were asked to rate the group consensus. People commenting online, repeating themselves over and over again, people in a discussion just saying the same thing. has more of an impact than you might think. Lastly, social heuristics. There's a lot of our background processes that are devoted to how other people view us, how we view ourselves in society. And one is the idea of social proof, that if other people are doing it, that you should too. If other people believe it, you should too. I think there are times it's reasonable. If all of my friends are jumping off a bridge, there might be a fire behind us. But it's commonly used, for example, hotels. They wanted to reduce the water used, so they want their guests to reuse towels. And it turns out one of the most effective things they can do is have a sign saying that most guests reuse their towels. If you want to reuse your towel, please hang it up again, otherwise leave it on the floor. And this really worked. Unfortunately, it goes the other way. There was a historic forest with a lot of petrified wood, and they did A/B testing with two signs. One that said, please don't remove any historic artifacts from this forest. The other that said, millions of pieces of petrified wood are removed from this forest each year. Please respect our nature. Yeah, crime went up with the second one. Because the idea is, oh, this is a common thing, lots of people do it. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Reciprocity, there's a strong sense that if somebody's done us a favor, that we should do them a favor. This is some of Robert Cialdini's earlier works, and really cited that people who, in a survey, again, lies, one participant said, I bought a couple Cokes. They gave me another one. Here, do you want it? And gave the real subject a Coke, and later asked him to buy raffle tickets. People who were given a Coke bought far more raffle tickets than people who were not given a Coke at the beginning. I mean, I guess you want to do them a favor, but this is pretty easily hacked. And you look at a lot of organizations that send you, a coffee mug, a tote bag. Your alumni association, I'm sure, will send you things and then ask you for money. And it's a lot of trying to exploit this sense of reciprocity. Public commitments are really big. We have a strong aversion to seeing ourselves as a hypocrite. The more public a statement is, and the more people, the more verifiable it is, the less we want to go against it. People who are asked to volunteer for a particular AIDS benefit at a high school or school, I forget which level, were asked either just verbally agreed to it, and I think 19% actually showed up. For those who filled out a small form, putting it down on paper that they were going to attend, it went up to, I think, 50-something percent? 49%. That's a pretty big increase for just a short piece of paper asking people to fill out. Researchers called a lot of people and asked them about their voting history and asked them whether they would vote in the upcoming election. Some of them, they left it at that and later followed up to see. Others were asked, oh, why are you going to vote? These are the people who said they would. Just that simple thing of asking for a reason, why will you vote? And having them say it to the researcher boosted voting from 61.5% to 86.7% who actually turned out. That's pretty easy. There are a lot of ways that we can use this for good, but it can also be used for evil. And lastly, a sense of identity. I mentioned this with the backfire effect. It's very strong, but one of the things I love about these studies, it doesn't have to necessarily be an identity that they associated with themselves. Researchers called a lot of people and asked them about their voting history and their preferences and their views, and then at the end, randomly told them that they were either likely to vote or not likely to vote in the upcoming election. Those who were told that they were a likely voter went up from, it increased voter turnout by 15%. Telling somebody you are likely to vote, you're a voter, you're a civic person. Again, purely randomly. I like the idea, it's a little devious, but of telling people, you know what, I've heard that you're really good at open discussion and being willing to change your mind or admit when you're wrong. And I appreciate that. Thank you for really being willing to discuss this with me. Just saying that at the beginning might really help because suddenly they think, oh, I guess I am a person who listens and has an open mind. So defense. I've been talking a lot about how hopeless this is and how easily we're hacked, and is there a way to defend ourselves? And yeah, there is some hope. Constant vigilance, turns out. This is only partly joking, but Daniel Kahneman, professor, said, the way to block errors that originate in system 1 is simple in principle. Recognize the signs you're in a cognitive minefield, slow down, and ask system 2 for help, for reinforcements. He then added, unfortunately, this sensible procedure is least likely to be applied when it is needed most. He's quite pessimistic publicly about the ability to improve people's decision-making. As we learned earlier, simply knowing the statistics isn't enough to really change your sense of the world. But there are some reasons for hope, and some of it comes from a study that is really commonly brought up. Robert Cialdini did it, but most people talk only about the first half, and then they stop. So I want to share that with you. There's a copier machine, and a woman comes up and says that tries to cut in line. She says, I have 5 copies. May I cut in front of you? 60% said yes. Okay, that's not bad. If she said, I have 5 copies, can I cut in front of you because I'm in a rush? 94% said yes. Well, okay, maybe that makes sense. We want to help her out because she's in a hurry. But what if they had a bad reason and said, I have 5 copies, can I cut in front of you because I need to make some copies? Yeah, no shit. 93% still said yes. And the reason that most people assume this is true is the word because is in there. And we have this sort of automatic assumption and this heuristic that people use the word because there's a good reason going on, that we should acquiesce. And that's where most people stop talking about the study. But there's a second half in which she had 20 copies. I have 20 copies, may I cut in front of you? Only 24% said yes. And 4 times as much time, more chances that the copier will jam up. With a good reason, I have 20 copies, may I cut in front of you because I'm in a rush? 48%, it doubled. Not bad. Good for humanity. How about the bad reason? I have 20 copies, may I cut in front of you because I'm in a rush? Or sorry, because I need to make copies. Anybody want to guess? Nobody wants to guess. Yeah. That's fine. Back down to 24%. Saying a totally nonsense reason didn't have an impact when there were more copies. And to me, this says that when something is a bigger deal and we want to pay more attention to it, suddenly we're not operating as much on heuristics, and we start thinking, oh, is it worth it? Do I need to be somewhere? Yes, I can make the sacrifice of my time or not. And managing attention turns out to be really important in building defenses against persuasion. So some general principles in building your defenses. First, learn to notice your emotional reactions and check yourself before making decisions. I'm not saying be totally calm and Spock before you decide things. Sometimes emotions are really reasonable, but it's easy to exploit somebody by evoking a strong emotional reaction and then asking them to do something, especially anger, resentment. These are things that politics uses a lot and inspires, trying to get people to see each other as enemies and then take action. Be aware of your energy level. It's difficult to pay attention when you're tired. You just can't devote as much of your expensive system to mental cycles when you're tired. Third, recognize common manipulation techniques and start paying attention. So for me, I know when I heard these studies, now there's a little flag whenever I hear somebody use the word because. And I just say, wait, what are they doing? And I'm not saying they're manipulative, they're trying to exploit me. It's a common word, but I know I'm more likely to agree, not necessarily for good reasons, if they use the word because. And I stop and I pay more attention. And this is true for other techniques, not just the word because. Paying attention, if you notice a technique, it's going to help. Let's jump to the ethics for a moment. I've seen a lot of discussion about how to communicate ethically. I was in the Public Relations Society of America, and there was an ethics conversation. Some of the ideas people have come up with for how to use these tools well is, are you informing or coercing? It's not so easy to see what coercion is at certain points and how much are you informing. Are you treating people with respect? I know it was tougher for me to treat people with respect after learning all this. Are you exploiting knowledge imbalances? If they knew what you knew, would they still do what you're asking or believe what you're asking them to believe? That's not a bad one. Are you giving the reasons that persuaded you? At first I really liked this. But then I realized you don't necessarily know what persuaded you. There are a lot of mind hacks that are affecting your judgment. And can you share them? Can you really present, oh, by the way, also, I was in a good mood when they asked me to do this, and so I think you should too. No. And lastly, are you making the world a better place? This is an almost obvious one. I like it a lot. As a consequentialist, I think that we should be trying to make the world a better place if we want to behave ethically. But I kind of want to start at the ground level and work up a little bit to find some principles. What is the harm? Why do we need these defenses? So we just went over how to defend ourselves. Why do we need defenses? And the dangers of persuasion are that people might mislead you for personal gain. This is the malicious type of unethical behavior that causes harm. This is scam artists, false advertising, things that are going to harm you or not really do you much good, but are going to help somebody else, and that's manipulation, or being factually mistaken or overconfident. This is sort of the incompetent angle of immorality. And yeah, we're really bad at judging our level of confidence. We have a strong view in society that you either hold a belief or you don't. And if you think something is true, you should persuade people of it, definitely, and they should hold it. But how confident should you be? Do you have a 60% odds of this being right? Do you think it's a 99% likely to be true? Then you can persuade people more. But even if people aren't malicious, they don't have a good sense of how to calibrate their confidence. And so they might be using these powerful tools and swaying you far more than they should. And that could lead you down bad roads. And so, in order to prevent this harm, or at least mitigate it, what should society do? And that's, to me, the nutshell, the heart of ethics. What should society praise, punish, condemn, reward? What kind of behaviors do we want to see people do in order to create the society we want to live in? And to prevent people from misleading you for their own personal gain, we should encourage persuasion techniques and actions that leave people happier and with more accurate beliefs. Again, that mostly speaks for itself. We should leave the world a better place. That's behaving ethically. But the other one is more interesting. To correct for the accidental and unintentional misleading people by being overconfident or not really calibrating, we should encourage persuasion techniques that engage our system too, that let reality and reason guide our efforts. If we're overconfident and let reality check us, we'll do less damage to people than if we run full force just because we think something is true. And there are some ways to do this. I like the idea of do unto others. It's a pretty good start for ethics. Can we put checks on our own power to make sure that we are behaving ethically and not accidentally being overconfident and persuading people more than we should? And it turns out you can do this and still be effective. And I want to go into a lot of techniques, hopefully pretty quickly, about how to be persuasive and still engage people's system too. So for ourselves, we can learn to pay attention, but for other people, we can use techniques that help them engage their system too automatically. First, we were talking about monitoring emotional reactions, and to engage system two, we want to make sure that we give people time to think. This is repeatedly found that when people have time to think, especially after an emotional appeal, they end up making better decisions. And so if you're at a used car dealership and they're trying to press you to make a decision pretty quickly, it's likely that they're more likely to be exploiting you. But if you give people the pitch, let them wait, and then let them decide, it's more likely to be their system too and their reason making the decision. Reducing pressure to act. How many of you have heard the expression, a hard sell? Really, yeah, pressuring people into something. I really liked this study that found very robustly in different phrasings, different placements, but a very useful thing that you can do is tell people a simple expression along the lines of, but you're free to say no. Telling people that they have an out, that it's not all or nothing, that it's up to them, actually makes you more persuasive. And I like this. It feels more ethical not to force somebody into something, and instead let them decide. You're more persuasive, and it's more likely to let good arguments win because it engages their better faculties. And lastly, affirming their value. The backfire effect from a little earlier on, in which people had this strong sense of identity that was being challenged, and they reaffirmed themselves. Well, there are a couple of ways to combat it, turns out. Brendan Nyhan and Raefler, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, have been doing great research on this. I love it. One way they found combated it was to use visual representations. It gets into our brains better. But the other was to walk people through a self-affirmation exercise first and ask them, what's important to you? What have you done well recently in this regard? And walking people through this and then presenting them with contradictory evidence, the backfire effect didn't happen as much. I like this. People don't get defensive. I don't need to make people defensive. I don't want to make people defensive. And I can be more persuasive if I don't do that. Managing mental energy, we talked about making sure we can pay attention even if we want to. And to engage system 2, avoid decision fatigue. We lose energy as we make lots of decisions. This is why supermarkets put the impulse purchases like the gum and the candy right at the end. When we said, oh yeah, I guess I should get the fresh fruit and the lettuce. And then at the end say, yeah, sure, I'll get the Kit Kats. Secondly, interacting during the day. When you're at night, you don't have as much mental energy, and so it is much easier to exploit System 1 heuristics. You're not as likely to engage System 2. So to be more ethical and make sure that you are persuading people towards good causes, going during the day and asking them for things is better. By the way, Cialdini thinks that this is why infomercials run late at night. And giving them a dose of caffeine. Remember I talked about distributing a chemical that makes people more likely to believe you? That's true, but only for good arguments. People were presented with good and bad arguments. I think it was for the death penalty. And given a drink either with or without caffeine. They didn't know whether they'd gotten it. They might have felt it a little bit. But the people who'd been given caffeine found the good argument more persuasive and the bad argument less persuasive compared to the people that were not given caffeine. I like this a lot, not just because I love caffeine, but because there are ways that make good arguments stand out and win. And it doesn't have to be about tricking them into it. And so meeting people at a coffee shop is not a sign of being manipulative. It is actually saying, I trust my arguments, and I think that your better reasons will find me persuasive. Focusing, help people focus, and yourself when you're being persuaded. Finding something that people care about. As I said, the emotions are really important in motivating our actions and our beliefs. Finding something that people care about. You're not really going to pay attention to anything you don't care about. This is why 20 copies made a much bigger difference than 5, and suddenly you started paying attention with a bigger request. Secondly, speaking slowly and clearly. Turns out that if people can engage with your ideas and arguments with a favorable audience, speaking slowly and more clearly, people could engage with it and they found it more persuasive. But if you have an audience that's likely to disagree with you, speaking more quickly was more persuasive. The researchers think this is because they couldn't immediately counter your arguments, they couldn't really grasp all of what was going on. A lot of advertisers like talking really quickly, and I think that's a sign of something. And lastly, breaking people's expectations. If everything that's going on is just expected, normal, routine, status quo, that's not going to get attention. There's a book, Made to Stick, by Chip and Dan Heath, that I like a lot. It doesn't involve a ton of psychology studies. It involves some, and some of their later books do a great job of that, like Decisive. But they lay out the things that make an idea stick in people's minds and really help people grasp it. And one of the things is being unexpected, very important. So disrupt and reframe is one of the things that I've heard in Persuasion, that give people a weird way of looking at something and then get back into the conversation to jolt them awake. And these are guidelines. These are ways that you can help yourself and help others and behave more ethically. But of course, all rules have exceptions. And these are some things that give me pause. Anytime that somebody has a set of ethical principles and then says, and here are some exceptions, here are reasons to break them, it's dicey trying to figure out when to apply them and when you're just looking for an excuse not to behave ethically. But here are some of the reasons that I've come up with that give me pause. Does the medium allow nuance? Can you really do all of these tools on Twitter? No. Can you do all of these on Facebook very well? Not really. The internet medium is not very good for a very ethical persuasion. Although written arguments are engaging system 2 more than spoken and presented visual arguments. Are you correcting for the unsavory parts of human nature? Remember the study where little Rokia inspired more donations? Well, a lot of the ethics at the moment has been letting people use good reason to figure things out. What if they use good reason and don't want to help others? Can we use powerful persuasion techniques to inspire the best of each other? Not just because we use cold logic, but because we're correcting for something in us we wish weren't true. And lastly, are cultural opponents playing fair? Sadly, we do live in a world in which people disagree with us. I heard Campus Crusade for Christ be described as a cultural opponent of the Secular Student Alliance, for example. And if Campus Crusade for Christ is going around using really manipulative tactics to persuade people that they should come to Christ or disown their gay family members, if the secular people and people who support gay rights try to be just, reasonably calibrated, are we actually approximating truth? Or do we need to account for the fact that other people are not? Sadly, we live in an imperfect world in which people are not following all the rules. So, just recap for the various principles that I try to live by as I write fundraising letters and do communications. Are you, these are out of order a bit, but are you exerting influence proportionate to the confidence you have? So if you know that you're pitching something really hard and really strongly, but you're not so sure you believe it, that's a sign you're doing something wrong. Are you allowing reason and reality to guide your efforts? This is about engaging system 2 as much as possible. There's number 1. Are you acting in others' interests? It's a good sign you're behaving ethically if you are. And are you dealing with the world as it is? This is something that, as I've become more jaded perhaps, is something that I've had to accept that, no, this is what works, this is who we're dealing with. And it is a principle that we need to keep in mind. The takeaways that I hope we can discuss for Q&A is first, emotion and system 1 are part of decision making. Just accept that. That's really important. We need to acknowledge it. 2, the background systems can be hacked and exploited. 3, we can win with good arguments. It's not hopeless. We don't need to sink to a sleazy level in order to make our point and succeed. And lastly, influence is power. Protect yourself and others. So please use this knowledge for good. This is a lot of dark arts, but hopefully this is more the defense against the dark arts and how to defend others with the powers. So thank you all for coming out, and I'd love to take some questions in a minute.
I'm really going to do the index card thing, but I think we have small enough number of people. So I just do shouting.
Yeah.
So if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you, and yeah, we'll do it slightly moderated. So, yes, in the back.
Yeah, I had a quick question. You've gone over like a lot of individual tactics that we could use, but I studied economics. We talk a lot about public policy, so this might be a little offbeat, but do you have any sort of maybe like a legal action or a public policy that could help restrict these kind of immoral or unethical tactics? Have you ever thought about something like that?
I know there are various laws about false advertising. It's tough because there's so much you can do with the literal truth. I'd be willing to consider things like, I think it's called puffery, in which companies can say things like, world's best pizza. No, it's not. What kind of evidence do you have for this? But you say it, it's probably persuasive. And the law currently says that this is so obviously false that nobody's persuaded by it, and that it's okay to say, oh, I don't think that view is correct. I think that people are persuaded by it. And I'd be curious, I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but saying that getting rid of that rule, for example, and having a much better and more realistic sense of what does and doesn't work, and then addressing our public policy and our laws. Because at the moment, our laws were written in a time, still are written, assuming that humans are rational agents. And the more we discover, the more we know that's not true. So it's time our laws caught up with that.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Jennifer, and then we'll give Jessica.
As far as if you're speaking to somebody and you realize that they are using those techniques, whether or not they know that they're doing it, other than countering it yourself, is there anything you should or could say to them to be like, hey, you're kind of being really manipulative and it's not cool, or is that probably a bad idea?
It's a good question. On a personal, one-to-one level, sometimes I call them out, more for fun than anything else. UNC Chapel Hill calls and asks for money, and I start critiquing their pitch. I don't know that they're aware. I mean, they're probably given scripts to follow, and they don't really know what they're doing. I do have some hope that calling it out in public wakes people up and calls their attention, so they stop operating as much on the heuristics. But I don't necessarily think that people are doing it maliciously. This is trained just through social interaction. People find that certain things work, and they're more likely to do it in the future. This is how we learn to interact with other people. So unless it's a person who is, I hate to go back to the used car salesman trope, but somebody who just is obviously sleazy and manipulative, I would either just counteract it, let it go, or let people know that, yeah, you know what, they did this thing, it might have affected us. But in general, it's not always easy to know, so I don't have a hard and fast rule.
Jessica?
This is actually kind of an involved question. So, a lot of the research you cited, I think, like the way they're talking about all of this works, do you think that that has a clinical therapeutic practice, for example, with teenagers who have really maladaptive coping mechanisms socially? Do you think that there is a lot of room to revisit things like cognitive behavior, dialectical behavior there? Because they already sort of approximate something like this, but I think if it was presented in the context of like how to do it more ethically, because they kind of just try to get your function, do you think that it would potentially have therapeutic effects in that regard?
You mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'm really in favor of it, and I think that's a lot of what cognitive behavioral therapy is trying to do. Cognitive behavioral therapy trains people and tries to get them into the habit of paying attention to their inner thoughts and then examining them. Especially people dealing with depression and anxiety, which are uncomfortably common, have negative thoughts about themselves or negative thoughts about how things are going to turn out, and getting people to notice and pay attention. And a lot of CBT is saying, is that right? Hang on, pay attention, evaluate it, not just in how you feel. You might feel like a failure, but are you a failure? You do a lot of things right, don't you? And getting people to admit and especially write down, no, I do many things right. That thought was unproductive and false. I know reaffirming their identity, the idea of essentializing, somebody saying, I'm a failure, or I'm no good at this. CBT encourages them to say, wait, are you always no good at this? And they say, no, that's not really my identity. I often do badly at this. Sometimes I do well. So I hope to see it continues more. I think CBT is gaining attention, although there are some jokes that anything that works gets lumped in called cognitive behavioral therapy. But I think these are already being used. That's my impression. So.
Well, I would like to extend it to like in the context also of interpersonal relationships, because that's a lot of what DBT, which is the dialectical for borderline personality disorder, a lot of it actually will deal with like, repetition, like, people with borderline personality disorder, for instance, have like a really hard time saying no, or they have a really hard time like making themselves heard, or like saying what they actually want said. So it's like, if you get stressed out, just repeat yourself over and over and over again, and people will take you seriously. Do you think that there is like a way to get like this research looked at in a more serious light, or to get like CBT or DBT like into a more mainstream therapeutic protocol?
Oh, are they not? Do you not consider them mainstream already? DBT and CBT. Oh, okay. I guess I have a non-representative sample of friends and acquaintances who love CBT and talk about it all the time. If cognitive behavioral therapy is not one of the most commonly practiced, it really should be. I know there are some really good advocates for it. I hope they get more attention, possibly using these techniques. One of the things that frustrates me is that many scientists are very bad at communicating and persuading people of the truth. I love Bill Nye going on and debating people because he's actually good at talking with people and persuading them. I know Chris Mooney talks about how scientists need better communication and presentation skills. just for this reason, and maybe we could reach out to some CBT advocates and help them out. Maybe we can connect, somebody could connect advocates with researchers and persuaders who can tell them, you've got really good stuff, let's work on spreading it better. But I can't do that right now.
Daniel?
UNC Greensboro has less of a cultural opponent, labeling Christian Crusade for Christ as cultural opponent, as another organization called Make Up Your Own Mind, which is basically Christian abstinence veiled in just sort of this neutral, education group. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your experience with Secular Student Alliance being positioned as a cultural opponent to a group, and also what's your favorite Harry Potter book?
I'll answer the second one first. I have a strange love of number 3, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I think mostly because of the time travel component. Spoiler alert, sorry. I really like time travel, it's fantastic, but as a book itself, I liked Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix 5 for storyline. However, in terms of cultural opponents, I don't think there's two main contenders necessarily. I think there's a lot of people who disagree with each other and are vaguely on the same side or not on different issues. I don't always see them, in fact, I rarely see them as evil people, maliciously doing things. I do think that they're doing harm, and so I tend to see them as opponents, who I see as a very different thing than enemy. I hope to encourage a lot of secular student groups to see differing views like Ratio Christi, Campus Crusade for Christ, and Make Up Your Own Mind, as opponents that we are trying to collegiately persuade people of our view and have an open discussion. Because I still like the idea of free speech. We just need to incorporate free speech and difference of opinion with an understanding of how persuasion actually works. And so I think putting on more debates where people know a lot of these tools, countering some of their tabling efforts perhaps with pointing out the tools they're using, and tabling ourselves and spreading messages effectively to combat, to use an overly violent term, these memes. That's my hope. I really don't like animosity, so let's just counteract their influence.
Any other questions? Yes.
In your research or opinion, if you are talking to someone and you are trying to persuade them of something and you're trying to use a rational argument, what do you think has the most success actually getting someone to think in terms of system 2 instead of a reactionary system 1?
There are a few things, caffeine is a nice one. I've found, let me think if this is personal experience or research. So there is some research based on the framing and using the word think versus feel to, and it actually is not just that one is better than the other. It depends on who you're talking with. Some people are more affectively inclined, and you get that by filling out surveys, but sorry to stereotype, it turns out there are correlations, not concrete, but between gender and whether people are more influenced by affective words and saying, I feel blank versus I think blank is true. Men are more inclined, correlations again, not concrete, not every person certainly, towards being more influenced by saying, I think something is true. From personal experience, I know I like to phrase questions in a somewhat Socratic way, but express genuine interest about what they think and why, and say, oh really, that's interesting, because when I hear that, this is the other thing that I think. When I hear that you just have to take it on faith, I think, well, how do I distinguish that from the other faith claims? And let them work through it as though they were trying to make a good argument. And hopefully engage their system too, when they are not just operating on, I'm against them, I'm fighting, I need to persuade them and win this argument, but that we're on the same side, we're seeking the truth together. I like to use the word we a lot. How do we know? There's a really neat book, The Secret Life of Pronouns. Roger Pennebaker did huge analyses of people's word choice and in a lot of their writing and their psychology traits and states of mind, articles and pronouns were really important in terms of how strong the correlations were between how they felt at the time. So I do try very hard to make it a collaborative thing so that we don't get their defensive walls up and then walk them through an argument. But I think that's only somewhat anecdote and personal experience and somewhat research, so grains of salt.
All right, do one more question, and then we're gonna go to 90s, because it's, yes, me, like, Colin. Nope, Jessica.
I was just going to ask, is there research about whether or not rephrasing the same question over and over again with different terminology seems to have an effect? Because that's an anecdotal thing I use.
It's a question. Nothing comes to mind. I know the only relevant thing, which might not at all address your question, is that in psychology research, or I guess a lot of survey research in general, researchers phrase the same question differently throughout the survey to see if people actually hold the opinion or if they were somewhat guessing or not really sure of their opinions. And if they answer the same way, even if double negatives happen, then they're more confident that the person really believed it. And so the fact that they have to do that implies that people actually answer questions differently when they're framed differently. If people didn't, it wouldn't be an effective tactic, and I imagine researchers wouldn't do it very much. That said, humans are really slow to catch up on research and change their behavior, so it's possible. One plug before we go, or two plugs, sorry.
Go ahead.
One is the Center for Applied Rationality. This is an organization, I'll acknowledge first, my sister is the president and started it a little over a year ago. They're working to take the cognitive science that we're learning and help people turn it into habits. So cognitive science into cognitive practice, they call it. They run workshops. They were tired of the idea that we would learn cognitive biases, say, here's a cognitive bias. Good luck. And instead figure out what actual activities improved our decision-making processes. And so there's a lot of really neat stuff, and I went to one of their workshops early on. It was fantastic. I really felt like I learned a lot about myself and about making decisions. Daniel Kahneman, they're working with him and talking with him a little bit about how to use his research best to develop activities that train people. So he's notoriously pessimistic, but I think he's at least thinks there's hope, otherwise he wouldn't even bother with the Center for Applied Rationality. And secondly, since we're already here and nerdy and like Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, hold on to your hats, is a rationalist fanfic of Harry Potter, in which Harry is a prodigy scientist rationalist, and when he encounters magic, he doesn't just say, oh cool, I'm a wizard. He says, how the hell does this work? And why are things the way they are? And it's really great for teaching rationality and science lessons. It's a little ham-handed at first, I think I've described it. It's sort of bludgeoning people with, oh, and here's a study. But after maybe 5 chapters, it gets fantastic in terms of plot and characters, and at this point, I have some trouble remembering what's canon and what's from Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. So, if you like this kind of research and this topic, and you like Harry Potter, it's all free and online, hpmor.com. I found it fascinating, so I encourage you to check it out.
Thank you all for coming. Once again, we're going to Natty Green's afterwards. If you are here tonight, you've not been to one of our meetings and you'd like more information or you'd like to get on the newsletter, just come talk to me and we'll get you all set up. So thanks all. I'll see you a little later. And thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.